Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology. And today I'm talking to my colleague, Jeremy Rayner. Jeremy, like me, is a editor in the Department Anthropology of Economic Experimentation here at the Institute. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jovan.
Okay, so the talk on today, we're focusing on a book, but one that you actually published a few years before coming to the Institute. And the book in question here is this one, Back to the 30s, Recurring Crises of Democracy, Liberalism and Capitalism, but perhaps not in that order. Yep, okay, got the basic idea at least, yeah. We have a chance to talk a little bit about this project and find out what the main ideas behind it were. So, back to the 30s, right? So the core question that's kind of driving the book is trying to think about the present in relationship to this period between the world wars in the 20th century. So, can you tell me a little bit about what the inspiration for the book was?
Sure. I think as you picked up, it's a question, right? So and the book very much came out of a question I had, and I think a lot of people had. There was the question of how to understand the contemporary moment in relation to the 1930s. This was 2017. Right.
Okay.
So it's been about 10 years since the crash of 2007, which was comparable to the crash of 1929. So there was there had been a lot of thinking, writing about how much the crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression should inform thinking about the crash of 2007 and the Great Recession and everything that followed. So that was sort of one line of resonance of the interwar period, or of the 1930s specifically. And then the second one was specifically the election of Donald Trump in 2016, but also a sort of rising tide of right-wing populism, authoritarianism, which at the time included Viktor Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Duarte in the Philippines. So there was a brewing question about how much this phenomenon should be understood in terms of the right-wing authoritarian populisms of the 1930s, and especially its most famous incarnations in German and Italian fascism. So this was an active sort of topic of debate in public culture, say, maybe a little bit less so in scholarship, but I think it was an important question to tackle there, and so I proposed a panel at the AAA,
the AAA,
the American Anthropological Association annual meeting, just posing the question. Really, how should we understand the contemporary moment, given this political and economic aspects in the light of the 1930s or the interwar period? And from there, we had very interesting panelists present, and we got interest from an editor, and from there it just sort of became larger, and we started recruiting more people who were interested in exploring this question. We had a double panel at the Historical Materialism Conference in Athens, and we sort of put together this team of editors. One of them in particular, George Souvlis, who's a historical sociologist, did a lot to recruit an interdisciplinary team of people to look at this question in different national contexts and from different sort of thematic and theoretical points of view.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, in reading the introduction here, I can see that like this notion that we're seeing parallels between the contemporary era, and you were talking about 2017 and so on as being the contemporary moment in which you're talking about. Here we are sitting in 2025, and there's like the question for me, which I'll come back to later, is to what extent do these themes still apply today? Because they seem very, very clearly to apply. But yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. But so you've taken this very broad approach, looking across lots of various different national contexts. So what was behind that decision?
Right. So that was motivated, I mean, on the one hand, by the observation that there seemed to be that these both phenomenon that I mentioned had a global aspect, right?
Yeah.
So the crash of 2007 was notable and notably similar to the crash of 1929 in that it immediately affected essentially the entire world. So there's already a global question there. And then the question of right-wing sort of authoritarian populisms was also a global phenomenon. And so, or at least apparently so. So then part of the question was, to what extent can these be understood as global phenomenon? And would that help us to inform a kind of theory of a world system or of a global, to be able to understand the world globally from particular cases and in dialogue with particular cases, but also paying attention to the possibility that we are looking at global phenomenon specifically.
Yeah.
So I've always been very interested in those kinds of questions of global processes.
Yeah.
And so the framing of the book was also intended to address that question of the kind of globality of this comparative framework.
Okay. Yeah. And you yourself look at South America in your own chapter, which again, maybe I'll come back to in a second, but I'm just sort of interested in this general question of like how you use the past as a kind of a resource for understanding the present. Like this notion of historical repetition is something that comes up a lot in these sort of, phrases that we know, that Marx saying, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce, or, Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes, these kinds of ideas. And then the question of what we can actually learn from history. Those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it, this kind of notion. But then there's also, like Hegel said, we learn from history that we don't learn from history. So I guess I'm interested in two questions, what is the nature of this relationship between the present and the past? Is it a necessary relationship? Is it are we going through similar processes to back in the 1930s, or is it just coincidence? So yeah, on one side of things, and then the question, the extent to which we can actually learn something that can maybe affect how we proceed in the present.
Yeah. So that really gets to the core of what we're trying to explore here, and I think all of those phrases, all of those aphorisms have truth to them. I think there's no one right answer actually in how to understand the present in relation to the past. There's certainly continuities, and especially if we talk about the 1930s or the interwar period, there are clearly continuities to today. I mean, it's very much, in many ways, the same world. I mean, it's a capitalist world. There are states, there are presidents, there's racism, there's nationalism. And a lot of what we have in our world today was actually created in the 1930s, which was a very kind of productive time in terms of institution building. Those sort of New Deal orders, social democracy, those kinds of things were gestating in that period. And of course, contemporary fascist right-wing movements as well. So there's, there are direct continuities, right? And then some things that have been relatively submerged and have not been prominent, I think, have returned to to prominence, right? So I think that's one way to think about the connection. Another way is I do think there are something like long-term cycles in capitalist history. I think the best scholar addressing that is the now late Giovanni Arrighi, who's a historical sociologist who does like a world system theory of a kind.
And you discuss him in your chapter.
Yes,
right?
yes, quite a bit. He's sort of a presence in the whole book, right? So in that sense, we are in a moment which is structurally analogous to the interwar period, which would be a moment of financialization.
Okay, so can you maybe just break down what you mean by that?
So the sort of emphasis in capitalism has shifted from production to finance. So there's relatively more accumulation going on through financial means, through indebtedness, through financial intermediation, those kinds of mechanisms. And that also goes along with higher levels of personal indebtedness, private indebtedness, as well as, I would argue, increasing inequality, a lot of insecurity. And there are also times of systemic chaos, as Arrighi calls it. So I think there are times at which sort of existing hegemony or leadership in the world system becomes contested and unclear. And that also goes along with increased competition between states. There's times when there are times of increased competition really between firms and between states, right? So this is part of the argument, is that when you have a lot of capitals investing in the same sectors, right? So when an industry is new, it's more profitable, and then it accumulates competitors, and profits decrease, and so it becomes less profitable to invest in production, and more capital goes into finance.
Okay.
So there are times of increased competition between firms and between nations, and that also contributes to systemic chaos, as Arrighi would call it. So in that sense, I think these are homologous moments, and they have a certain structural similarity, which is one of the reasons that we see similar kinds of economic and political phenomena, which is not to say that one moment can be reduced to another, or they're identical. But one of the most important aspects of this kind of moment is that it's also a moment in which new productive technologies, or what sometimes called techno-economic paradigms, are being gestated.
So
in the 1920s and 30s, the question was really like, what will the world of manufacturing and the automobile look like, right?
Okay.
And now I think the question is more like, what will the world of artificial intelligence, digital capitalism look like?
Right.
And in both periods, I think there's a substantial, powerful interest not wanting that question to be decided democratically, essentially. So that is one of the sort of major sources for this sort of increase in authoritarianism in both periods.
I see. Okay. So emerging out of a sort of a necessity in the way capitalism is developing in a particular time, you see a push towards particular kinds of political formations, or how should I understand it?
Well, necessity makes it seem mechanical, and maybe gives an alibi to people who. But I mean, I think there's definitely a push. So there's sort of an accumulation of contradictions that are difficult to resolve within the existing institutional framework, and a kind of accumulation of democratic demands. So in the 1930s, this was, you had Henry Ford, sitting on top of this productive infrastructure, to produce automobiles, and facing a lot of demands from labor unions, and also just the sort of infrastructure of physical infrastructure, financial infrastructure was not up to the task of creating the automobilized world that would enable expansion of its business at that time. And now I think we have, the sort of tech titans, Silicon Valley, concerned that, this sort of wave of regulation of tech is going to hold back their possibility of creating the kind of world that they want to, or pursuing the AI business to its full potential.
So the argument would go that they then favour more authoritarian forms of government.
They're quite explicit about this, actually. The most explicit about this is Mark Andreessen, who's part of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk's circle.
Yeah, Peter Thiel is the CEO of Palantir, right?
I believe.
Yeah.
And Andreessen is the head of Andreessen Horowitz, which is an investment company. He's a billionaire based in Silicon Valley. Also, one of the inventors of the web browser as we know it. Right? But he wrote 2 years ago. He wrote a manifesto for the right to untrammeled technological development as the kind of central driving force and necessity of civilization, essentially. And he approvingly cites and even refers to as a saint Marinetti, who was the Italian futurist and one of the founders of Italian fascism. He wrote the Fascist Manifesto, one of the first fascist manifestos.
Okay.
So this, and Musk has also been very clear in saying that he believes that that he should be able to make investment decisions untrammeled by interference by government or democratic forces of any kind. So they agree on this. And there's also a very interesting interview with Andreessen in the New York Times recently, in which he basically says that he now supports Trump because of concerns that the Biden administration was planning to regulate artificial intelligence.
Okay.
On the one hand, on the other hand, that they were seeing that the employees, the tech workers in Silicon Valley, were being politicized by the university. So part of this right-wing authoritarianism of the present Trump incarnation is also an attack on universities as institutions that create critical thinkers, as I would say. But they were finding their own workforce difficult to manage.
Okay.
Andreessen describes it himself as a social revolution that was going on. And that, so, I don't remember who said it originally, but, one of the aphorisms is that behind every fascism is a failed revolution, And even if, what was happening in California in 2010, 2015 does not look to us like a revolution, definitely I think to these people it did. And especially when they started getting called before Congress to justify social network architectures and being threatened with regulation about artificial intelligence and all that, they started to feel that they were being hemmed in a way that was unacceptable for them.
I see. So I believe you also have a quote that you wanted to share with me that Donald Trump has recently
right.
posted,
So this is
because it also goes back to the same
right.
Italian fascist futurist, right?
It does not. It does not. No.
Right.
But it could have. It definitely could have. Right. So I mean, at the time that this book came out, I think there was still quite a bit of ambiguity about the usefulness of considering Trumpism in terms of classical fascism, and I think that in part because of the influence of the Silicon Valley billionaires that we were just discussing, I think that is absolutely unquestionable now.
Okay.
And I think really, ironically, this book came out almost the same month in which, or maybe 2 months before, the attack on the Capitol by Trump supporters, which was an anti-democratic putsch attempt. And I think that really clarified where Trump stood in relation to a sort of more vitriolic, more vicious, aggressive anti-democratic impulse. And now that after his re-election, he is really pushing the boundaries of his authority and as much as he can. I think clearly attempting to consolidate an authoritarian state. So he has this. He pinned to the top of his feed on his account in his ironically named Truth Social, the following quote, which is, "He who saves his country does not violate any law."
And that's from?
That is attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte.
I see.
But it's one of these sort of apocryphal quotes that nobody can actually find the original source of. But of course, it's important that it's attributed to Napoleon. So that, I mean, but he's essentially declaring himself to be above the law, which is really one step from the Führerprinzip, you know, if that, it is basically, you know, he gets to decide what the law is, or at least like at the most, history will decide based on whether it was saving the country or not, I suppose one could say. I think that this incarnation of Trumpism is clearly wanting to be untrammeled by the fetters of representative democracy.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, the historical parallels seem clear, you know. So, like, returning to the book then, would you then say that the basic thesis of the book has been borne out, or would you say that there are certain aspects of what you are arguing in the book that you would have to rethink? You know, what would you write, how would you write it differently if you were writing today?
Well, I mean, you know, we had 21 chapters, so there's a lot of different sub-arguments, right? And it is a bit more of a question than a thesis, right? But I think behind the question there is at least an assumption that there's something to be gained by making the comparison, right? And I think absolutely, I think that's been borne out, and unfortunately, I think it's been confirmed in a way that is profoundly worrying. So I take no pleasure in saying that I think that the book was correct to assume that there are strong parallels between the contemporary moment and the 1930s. That said, there are a lot of oversights of the book, and of course things that appeared to be salient at the moment, which are not so much today. At the time that the book came out, you know, there was still, you know, the 1930s itself had a fascist direction, also had a strong kind of progressive left direction. A lot of progressive institutions were created at that time, and a lot of intellectuals. And so there's and you know, at the time that the book was written, there had been a wave of sort of left populisms that were promising kinds of non-fascist alternative futures, right? Syriza, Podemos in Spain. There was a bunch of them. Pink Tide in Latin America, although that was a bit earlier. So there was a sort of sense that, and there was also a kind of attempt by progressives in the United States to take back the 1930s as a kind of, there's this idea of the Green New Deal, which was also taken up in Europe, you know, sort of Biden wanted to describe himself as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know, this sort of like a sense in which the resonance of the 30s might not be only fascism and war, but that seems less relevant now. Who seems to have the initiative now, at least for the moment, is the sort of neo or post-fascist right. In that sense, I think the book underemphasized that potential. And also, I think some of the chapters, but not all of them. I mean, we didn't see this coming, but I think the shift of Silicon Valley into the neo-fascist camp, I think, has been a major change, which I at least didn't see coming and was not. At least one of our chapters by Samir Ganesha does mention artificial intelligence, and that's sort of, I think some of our authors were more had their finger on the pulse a bit more there than I did. But so that's one issue, and another one which I think is sort of underplayed maybe is certainly is the ecological question. Another thing that the sort of Trumpists are reacting to is, the post-carbon transition. And so he's heavily backed by oil and gas interests, and everybody who would be against everything from decarbonization to, a global plastics treaty. So that's a
he's even bringing back the plastic straws.
right.
Apparently.
Yeah, he has this obsession with plastic straws. They even at some point sold Trump branded plastic straws. I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but yeah. So there's a reaction against this sort of attempt to place some limits on extraction of and burning of carbon in particular. That is distinct from the situation in the 30s. So again, Samir Gandesh's chapter was very correct to put his finger on that as being a central contradiction of our times, which rather than the 1930s was a lot more about the labor capital contradiction, and today we have a new prominence of the ecological question and contest over how and who will bear the costs of a degraded planet.
So when trying to think about like how this question of back to the 30s, can be applied, it seems like we're like this question. Okay, historical cycles are going on, but what is also striking is the way that the 30s itself is a kind of a discursive resource that is used on different sides of the current debate. So it must be, in trying to analyze this, it must be quite difficult to try and.
That's a really interesting question. And what, Taylor Nelms, who was one of our editors, really wanted the book to go more in that direction. I think it's a very interesting question as well. I'm not sure exactly what to say to it, except that I think that the way that the 1930s has figured actually since the end of the Second World War, really as a kind of warning, in different kinds of,
yes, right.
It's sort of like the worst that capitalism or the modern state has to offer. And so its invocation is rhetorically powerful, but also polarizing. And so there's, a active debate about how useful it is politically to make these comparisons in electoral politics or, in particular. I think that I'm on the side of the necessity of recognizing the continuities and similarities with that period. And I think it served as a warning as a kind of warning and symbol and rhetorical device for a reason, and I think that we shouldn't let go of that. But it would be interesting to have another volume exploring that question, actually. I think it would be very interesting.
Yeah, and at the same time, though, I think that like what comes out of the different chapters too is a sense of like critically interrogating this question back to the 30s, and also maybe looking at what are the pitfalls of assuming too close a parallel. Like, do we miss the differences, or are there other things going on that sort of comparative approach is going to miss?
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think the salience of the ecological question is one important one. I think there's also a danger of sort of misrecognition or expecting, even where they're possibly common or similar processes, like expecting them to look the same. That's one issue. So there's an interesting debate right now about whether is one of the best sort of scholars of fascism is sociologist Dylan Riley. It's the argument that the contemporary authoritarian populisms should not be understood as fascist because they don't have the capacity for social mobilization. So he contests this sort of Arendtian analysis that fascism arose in a individuated, atomized society, saying that actually it arose out of a very dense and active civil society. And he says, well, that actually is in contrast to today. Well, there is no dense and active civil society. But some observers, including Jonathan Gans, who's, I think, a very interesting contemporary observer of the right, argues that misses the centrality of online organizing. So there is a very active civil society. It just doesn't look like the civil society of the 1930s. It's not people meeting in in bars and
huge rallies
and stuff. But they are meeting and associating, and that has had political effects, which are actually, for Gans, confirm that thesis about fascism, but in a way which would say that we are actually looking at contemporary fascist movements precisely because they are actually grounded in active civil society. So it points to, for example, the enormous communities that exist around conspiracy theories like QAnon. And those people actually do have capacity to mobilize, as the attack on the Capitol showed. So they do have the capacity to even meet in person and carry out physical attacks. So I think that is that gets to the complexity is also the question of but I think that what that asks for is attention and nuance, and rather than putting that comparison aside, I think it actually calls for a more sophisticated and nuanced takes,
and using it as a sort of you could call, say, a productive space in which to think about these things. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I also just add to that, I think like there's a danger of being too positivist about the question, because by the time that you prove that, a historically informed thesis would say a good number of big businessmen and women will be prone to support a fascist cause. By the time that that's proven empirically, it's too late. So there's historical judgments that one makes based on past evidence that can't necessarily wait for empirical validation. So I think there's a call for nuanced and analyses which are attentive to differences and complexities, but also a certain willingness to trust in the abstractions that you can take from those lessons, right? That's where I would urge people to place their attention in making these kinds of assessments.
Okay. All right. So this edited collection is very interdisciplinary. You have people from a whole range of different fields contributing, and not so many anthropologists, really, even though I believe you and the other editors are mainly anthropologists. So, it raises the question for me, with this very historically focused topic, what is the prime value for anthropology, or how can anthropologists best engage with this book?
That's a great question. From my point of view, I think, insofar as anthropology, social cultural anthropology is based in participant observation, I think that participant observation always needs to be supplemented by context, by comparison, by history, by political economy, psychology, economics, philosophy, something that goes beyond the immediate context of observation. And I think, I would encourage, there is a sort of standard way that anthropology approaches, or cultural social anthropology approaches history. Of course, there are many different ways, right? But I mean, a sort of standard ethnography will have like a history chapter, which will be like maybe an immediate context, immediately before, and sort of history conceived in a very kind of linear way. So I think it would be interesting for us to think about different ways of using history. Maybe you might find resonance in your field observations in some other moment. And actually, I would argue that the interwar period is now particularly productive of insights. But maybe in that history chapter, instead of going to the immediate past, going to 100 years ago. I mean, and I think, I think for anthropologists, it's always good to have in the back of our minds, a bit of a question of how the world as a whole is working. So I was much trained in the sort of Eric Wolf political economy tradition, and I think that's an important component of providing more thorough explanations for the phenomenon that we engage with.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, a thought that occurs to me too is just the simple sense of like this notion that when we're thinking about the 1930s, we're not just talking about a historical era, but we're talking about a kind of a discursive resource, that's being drawn on by different people. So the past features in contemporary practice as well. So how people are drawing on the past then becomes very much an aspect of what we're trying to understand in the present, as say as.
I absolutely agree with that, especially if you're working in doing fieldwork in Europe or even now the United States. I think that these things are very, very present in the way people frame their own experience and their consciousness of history and politics. They're sort of, often sometimes in a kind of what may seem an unscholarly or cartoonish way, but invocations of this period are constant, even and a kind of very active part of our politics. So that, So, and it's interesting, I think, to juxtapose those, the sort of historiographical approach and the sort of cultural approach to.
And I found it quite interesting that one or two chapters in the book are like also looking at the way, say, your typical liberal critique of the far right evokes, the dangers of fascism and so on, as so in a sense similar to the basic thrust of the book, and yet those chapters then sort of critically analyze that own liberal evocation of the 30s or of.
That's very true. Yeah, I mean, some of the most interesting chapters in the book deal precisely with how a certain kind of anti-fascism might be encouraging the rise of fascism and this sort of idea of authoritarian liberalism. So there's a chapter by Michael Wilkinson and by Saigon Gokarksil.
Yeah,
both address that question in very interesting ways.
Okay. And so just very quickly, authoritarian liberalism seems like a contradiction in terms.
Right. So that is a description of a constitutional order in which the liberal rights to private property and free markets are prioritized over democratic rights. It has been applied to a number of different formations, but has been productively applied, I think, to the neoliberal period in which many institutions of economic life were placed either by elite consensus or by institutional design out of democratic reach. So policymaking, the sort of the example which is cited in the book is several times is the cancellation of the Grexit referendum. So this sort of, you voted wrong. So
yes.
And I think there was one of the citations of, I don't remember who, unfortunately, but somebody I think from the European Commission who says that a referendum can't be allowed to interfere with economic policy.
Yeah, that was Schäuble.
Okay. Yeah. So there's this question of a kind of authoritarianism that puts a lot of our life actually outside of any kind of democratic decision making.
Right.
And
because the economic orthodoxy becomes just so sort of necessary that it has to be placed somehow outside of democratic processes.
Right. And so the argument is that has created a world in which people feel powerless. And has sort of eviscerated democracy of any real substance, right? So then that makes fascist authoritarian responses or promises or more attractive.
Right. Yeah, and I think like the concept authoritarian liberalism was initially used in relationship to a critique of the Weimar Republic, and sort of.
Yeah, so there's a very interesting debates about, right, the sort of status of the Constitution, and then Carl Schmitt as a thinker critiquing the Weimar Constitution, as we know, very close to, or an active crown jurist of the Nazis, as they call. But a lot of his, he developed the argument that the the real core of the Constitution was in the liberal economy, not in democracy, right? So, so the further could be totally justified in taking unconstitutional measures that protected that core Constitution.
Okay.
And as Michael Wilkinson points out, that's very similar to the post-war argument of, that the liberal capitalist order should be beyond democratic interference. Right? So there's actually, despite that, the neoliberals would consider themselves to be very far from Carl Schmitt and fascism. They're actually a lot closer than many of them are a lot closer than they might recognize. And that has allowed, many people to move from being sort of libertarians, neoliberals, to being fascists. And I think like Andreessen or Elon Musk would be perfect examples of that. Or Mark Zuckerberg, even, as I think is a little less enthusiastic about Trumpism, but he's still playing ball. So these are people who considered themselves to be liberals or libertarians who are really more committed to the untrammeled liberty of business than of any kind of sense of democratic collective freedom.
And as a way of wrapping up then, because, we're more or less out of time, key takeaway, something you would like to say, well, what does the book really sort of taught you?
Well, the book was, again, it started with a question, right? And so it was a journey, which continues, right? As we all are sort of confronting this context. I mean, I think to me, really, the sort of most important takeaway from the example of the 1930s is once anti-democratic authoritarians get their hands on the state, they don't give it back. So that's, I think, a lesson that has maybe been underappreciated.
All right. I think maybe we'll have to finish it on that somber, kind of sobering point. But yeah, we're living in sobering times. All right. Thank you, Jeremy.
Okay.
For an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Jovan.
Yeah.